Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive on the book The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck by Mark Manson.
Yeah,
It's a book that I think really kind of shook up the self-help worlds when it came out.
for sure.
And we're going to be talking about Manson's kind of unique approach to happiness and how choosing what to care about
Right.
can lead to a more fulfilling life. So right off the bat, the book starts out with this really interesting story about a Nepalese prince
Yes.
who had like everything you could possibly want, right?
Oh,
Wealth, luxury. He never had to experience any suffering,
right.
but he was completely miserable.
It's an interesting way to start a book like this.
Yeah, and he kind of uses this to set up what he calls the backwards law, this idea that the more we chase happiness directly,
Yeah.
the more it kind of like slips away from us.
Right, and it's kind of this paradox that he presents right at the beginning, and it's the idea that, so many of us are chasing this thing called happiness,
Right.
but the more we chase it, the more it seems to elude us.
Like so counterintuitive.
It is. It's
Yeah.
very counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But I think what he's trying to get at is that happiness isn't really a destination. It's
Right.
not like this finish line that we cross.
Yeah.
It's more about the journey.
Right.
It's about fully embracing all of the ups and the downs that life throws our way.
So you're saying it's more about the process of overcoming these challenges that we choose to kind of take on.
Absolutely. And it's like that old saying, happiness is a butterfly, chase it. And it eludes you, but if you just sit quietly, it may land on you.
I like that.
Yeah.
So it's not about like forcing ourselves to be happy all the time,
Right.
but it's more about finding meaning in the things that actually matter to us.
Yeah. I think that's a much healthier approach.
And this is where I think he introduces this hilarious character, the disillusionment panda.
I love that panda.
I know, right?
It's such a great image.
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't read the book,
Right.
the disillusionment panda is like this grumpy superhero who goes around telling people these really harsh truths about life.
Right. He's like the ultimate reality check.
Yeah, and I think Manson uses this character to kind of poke fun at our culture, especially with social media these days, where everyone's trying to project this image of perfect happiness.
Absolutely. And it creates so much pressure to always be positive.
Right, like any sort of negative feeling like stress, sadness, anxiety,
Mhm.
even boredom,
Yeah.
it's all seen as like a problem to be fixed instead of just part of the human experience.
It's like we're not allowed to feel anything but pure joy all the time.
Yeah, and Manson's saying that's not realistic. And it's actually kind of harmful because problems never really go away,
Mhm.
right? They just change form.
Exactly. They just kind of evolve.
He gives this great example of Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world.
Yeah.
And even he still has problems, just different problems than maybe most of us deal with.
Right.
And it really highlights that it's not about avoiding problems altogether. It's more about how we choose to frame them.
Exactly. And speaking of framing problems, have you ever heard of Hiru Onoda?
Yeah, he tells this crazy story about this Japanese soldier, Hiru Onoda, who like refused to believe that World War II was over.
For years.
Yeah, and he hid out in the Philippines for something like 30
Yeah.
years,
Wow.
still thinking the war was going on.
It's mind-blowing.
It really is a wild story,
Mm.
but it makes you think about, you know, what are we holding on to in our own lives that might be blinding us to reality?
Yeah, what are we clinging to that's not actually serving us anymore?
And it comes back to what Manson says about choosing our values carefully.
Absolutely.
Like Onoda's loyalty to Japan, which was obviously a noble thing in many ways.
Yeah.
But it ultimately became his prison because he refused to kind of adapt his worldview.
Right. He was so fixated on this one value that he lost sight of everything else.
It reminds me of another story he tells about Dave Mustaine, the guitarist who got kicked out of Metallica right
Yeah.
before they got huge.
Right.
And, he went on to have huge success with his own band, Megadeth,
Huge.
but he still felt like a failure because he was constantly measuring himself against Metallica.
Right. He was using the wrong yardstick. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the struggles we choose, but also the metric we're using to measure ourselves.
Absolutely.
Then there's Pete Best, the drummer, who got fired from the Beatles right before
Oh.
they made it big.
Oh, yeah. What a story.
And you would think he would be bitter,
Right. I'd think so.
but he actually found happiness by focusing on family and kind of like personal fulfillment.
It's a great example of how choosing different values can lead to a completely different experience of life.
Yeah, he basically chose a different path, and it led him to a place of contentment.
Yeah, it's really inspiring.
So all of these stories, they're really about this idea that we need to figure out what actually matters to us
Right.
and then build our lives around those values.
Absolutely.
But that also means saying no to the things that don't align with those values.
Oh, but yeah.
which can be really tough.
It can be really tough, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with messages about what we should be doing, what we should be buying, who
Yeah.
we should be. But Manson really encourages us to be more discerning about where we're directing our energy and attention.
And this is where he dives deep into the concept of entitlement,
Yep,
right?
it does.
And it's not just about the I deserve special treatment kind of entitlement.
Right.
It's also about feeling entitled to be offended all the time,
He calls it outrage porn, and it's everywhere these days.
especially online, right? It's like everyone's looking for something to be offended by.
Exhausting.
It really is.
And it distracts us from real problems. It's
Yeah.
like we're addicted to the drama and the outrage.
So how do we break free from that trap?
Well, Manson suggests a pretty radical approach. Embrace failure.
What do you mean?
He's not talking about intentionally screwing up, but rather seeing failure as a necessary part of growth.
Okay.
It's about shifting our perspective.
So instead of fearing failure,
Right.
we should see it as like a stepping stone.
Exactly. A stepping stone to learning and getting better.
It's like that saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs.
Oh, I like that.
And Manson even talks about hitting rock bottom early in life
Yes, he does.
and how that actually made taking risks later on feel less scary.
It's like he inoculated himself against the fear of failure.
So he learned that personal growth isn't about achieving some kind of perfect certainty,
Right.
but it's more about becoming less wrong over time.
It's a constant process of learning and evolving.
So it's not about having all the answers,
No.
but being open to changing our minds and admitting when we're wrong.
I think that's one of the most important messages of the book.
Yeah, but how do we actually put this into practice? Like, how do we start doing something instead of just thinking about it all the time?
Well, Manson advocates for this idea of the do something principle.
Okay.
The idea is that taking action, even imperfect action,
Yeah.
is the best way to break through procrastination and fear.
Oh, I like that.
Like, just get started, even if it's messy.
It's like that anecdote he shares about the successful author who forces himself to write 200 crappy words every day just to kind of get the ball rolling.
It's not about quality at first.
Right.
It's about building momentum.
I think that's a great takeaway for anyone who struggles with procrastination.
Definitely.
You know, all this talk about choosing our struggles and embracing failure, it kind of makes you realize that life is pretty fragile, isn't it?
It does.
And Manson actually tackles this head on in a section of the book called And Then You Die, where he shares this really heartbreaking story about his friend Josh, who took his own life.
It's a powerful reminder that our time here is limited.
Yeah. And it really drives home the point that we should be spending our time on the things that truly matter to us.
Absolutely.
And then there's that story about Erin, a woman who became obsessed with Manson after a near-death experience.
Yeah.
And she becomes convinced that they're like destined to cure death together.
It's a wild story,
It is.
but I think it's a cautionary tale about the danger of absolute certainty.
How so?
Well, Erin becomes so fixated on this one belief that she loses touch with reality.
Oh, I see.
It's a reminder that even positive beliefs, when taken to an extreme, can become problematic.
It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right?
Exactly.
And it reminds me of that book by Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death,
Oh, yes.
which Manson actually references.
He does.
And Becker basically argues that our awareness of our own mortality is what gives life meaning.
It's a powerful idea.
It is.
It's like knowing that our time is limited makes us want to make the most of it.
And Manson actually ends this section with this really vivid image of himself standing on the edge of a cliff at the Cape of Good Hope,
Yeah.
just kind of contemplating the vastness of time and the impact we choose to make.
It's a beautiful image.
Yeah, it really is. So we've covered a lot of ground here. This idea of the illusion of chasing happiness, the importance of choosing our values, the danger of entitlement, embracing failure as a path to growth, and even the reality of our own mortality.
It's a lot to take in, but I think it's important to think about these things. It's not always easy or comfortable, but it's ultimately about living a more intentional and fulfilling life.
Yeah, and I think we've just scratched the surface here.
Oh, yeah, there's so much more to unpack.
But we'll dive into all of that after a short break.
You know, one thing that keeps sticking out to me is how Manson weaves together all these seemingly unrelated stories and ideas. He's not really giving us a step-by-step guide to happiness. It's more about, learning to pick the right battles to fight.
I agree. And it always circles back to the values we were talking about
Right.
before the break. If we're not really clear on what's important to us, it's so easy to just get caught up in everyone else's expectations.
Absolutely. We start giving a think about things that don't actually matter to us deep down.
And then that brings us back to the do something principle, which I think so many people struggle with,
Oh, yeah.
including myself.
It's hard.
It is hard to break out of that overthinking
Yeah.
analysis paralysis.
He talks about it in the book. He uses this analogy of like figuring out how something works. Yeah.
By just messing around with it, like when you're a kid, you get a new toy
Oh, yeah.
and you just press all the buttons
Oh, I remember doing that all the time.
just to see what happens.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same with life. Like sometimes you just got to take action and like learn as you go.
Right.
He shares this really personal story about how he struggled with social anxiety for years.
Really?
Yeah, he spent most of his time playing video games and avoiding any kind of social interaction.
That's hard to imagine given like how successful he is now.
I know, it's crazy, right?
Hey.
But that's the point. He finally hit rock bottom, and he realized he had nothing left to lose, so he started a blog.
Huh.
And that blog eventually led to him writing this book
Wow.
and building this like super successful career as an author and speaker.
That's really inspiring.
It really is. It's a testament to the power of just like taking that first step, even if it feels terrifying.
So it's not just about thinking about living, but actually doing it. Absolutely, like choosing to actually experience life instead of just like theorizing about it in your head.
He makes this point about how our subjective experience shapes how we view our struggles. And he uses the example of running a marathon.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So like the physical pain of running 26.2 miles
Right,
is the same whether you're choosing to do it
right.
or you're being forced to do it.
The pain is the same, but the meaning we give it makes all the difference.
Exactly. So when we choose our challenges, even the difficult ones, they kind of become empowering.
Absolutely, they become like these badges of honor.
So it's not about avoiding pain altogether.
Right.
It's about picking the right pain.
Picking the pain that aligns with what we care about.
And I think this leads into like this important distinction that he makes between responsibility and fault.
Yeah, I think a lot of people confuse those two.
I know I do sometimes.
It's easy to do. We assume that taking responsibility for something means we're also to blame for it.
But that's not always the case.
No, it's not. Like, we can be responsible for things that are outside of our control.
Like our genetics.
Yeah.
Or the family we were born into.
Right. We
Yeah.
may not be at fault for those circumstances, but we are responsible for how we choose to deal with them.
So it's about recognizing the things we can control and the things we can't,
Yeah.
and then focusing on how we respond to those things.
And that's where our values come in.
Right.
They guide us when we're faced with those tough decisions.
And this kind of circles back to how our values are what we use to measure our lives.
Yeah, remember Dave Mustaine and Metallica,
Right.
or Hiro Onoda and his loyalty to Japan?
Right. They're using the wrong yardsticks.
Exactly.
Like, how do we make sure we're using the right ones?
Well, Manson warns against getting too caught up in what he calls metric values.
Like what?
Things like money, fame, possessions.
External stuff.
Yeah, the external markers of success. And he says chasing those things often leads to emptiness, even if we achieve them.
It's like that story of King Midas, you know? He wishes for everything he touches to turn to gold,
Oh, yeah.
which sounds awesome
Yeah.
at first.
Right.
But then he realizes he can't even eat or like hug his family without turning them into gold statues.
He ends up miserable.
So it's really a cautionary tale
It is.
about how chasing external validation can leave you feeling empty.
Even if you win the game, so to speak.
Right.
So Manson contrasts those metric values with what he calls experience values.
Okay, like what?
Things like love, connection, growth, making a difference in the world.
The internal stuff.
Yeah, the things that contribute to our inner well-being.
So he's not saying that achievements or success are bad.
No, not at all.
It's more about seeing them as like a byproduct of living a life that's aligned with our values
Exactly.
rather than the main goal.
And this ties into another key idea that Manson emphasizes, the importance of uncertainty.
How so?
Well, he says that personal growth is about becoming less wrong over time.
Okay.
It's not about achieving some absolute state of knowing.
So it's more about like constantly learning and evolving.
Exactly. And he even admits that he knows, like, in a few years, he'll probably look back on some of the ideas in his book and be like, wow, I was so wrong about that.
That's kind of refreshing to hear an author admit that.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Most self-help gurus act like they have all the answers.
It shows a lot of humility.
Yeah, and I think it also highlights that life is a constant process of learning and unlearning and relearning.
So we should be open to changing our minds, even about things we feel really strongly about.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to embracing failure.
Yeah.
Like, we're taught to avoid failure at all costs.
Right.
But Manson says it's actually an essential part of learning and growing.
He talks about how he used to be terrified of rejection,
Yeah.
but after experiencing so much of it in his 20s, it just lost its power over him.
He came to see it as feedback,
Yeah.
as a way to course correct and figure out what works.
So it's not just about choosing our struggles wisely,
Right.
but also choosing our failures wisely.
Exactly. And that brings us right back to the do something principle.
Yeah.
When we're willing to take action, we're bound to fail sometimes. It's
Yeah.
just part of the process.
And I think this applies to so many things in life, whether it's starting a business, learning a new skill, building relationships. Like, action is always the first step.
You got it. The more you're willing to fail, the less scary it becomes.
It's like facing your fears head on.
Exactly. And eventually, the fear starts to lose its grip on you.
You know, all of this reminds me of one of the most profound concepts in the book, this idea of like death giving life, meaning.
Heavy topic.
It is.
But it's one that Manson doesn't shy away from.
He really tackles it head on.
He does.
He argues that we spend so much time trying to avoid thinking about death.
Right, like it's this taboo subject,
Yeah.
but it's the one thing that we all have in common.
And that very awareness can be incredibly liberating.
He describes this moment where he's standing on a cliff at the Cape of Good Hope, staring out at the ocean, and he's just struck by this like awe-inspiring sense of vastness, but also the fragility of life.
And he connects this experience back to the work of Ernest Becker,
Oh, yeah.
who argued that our awareness of death is what motivates us to create meaning in our lives.
Like it pushes us to connect with others, to pursue our passions, to make a difference in the world.
Because when we're confronted with our own mortality, we're forced to ask ourselves what really matters.
It's a powerful reminder to live with intention,
Yeah.
to focus on what we value and make the most of the time we have.
And it leads naturally to this question of legacy, like what do we want to leave behind?
Right. What impact do we want to have on the world?
Manson uses this great analogy of the butterfly effect.
Oh, yeah.
A butterfly flaps its wings in Africa,
Yeah.
and it causes a hurricane in Florida.
It's this idea that our smallest actions can have a ripple effect.
So it's not necessarily about achieving some grand act of heroism.
Right.
It's more about living in a way that inspires others,
Yeah.
creates positive change.
Leaving things a little better than we found them.
Which brings us back to choosing our values carefully.
And those values become our compass,
Yeah.
guiding our actions.
And ultimately shaping our legacy.
But with so much noise out there telling us what we should care about, how do we even begin to figure out what truly resonates with us?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It is.
And it's something I think we should definitely explore further. So we left off talking about, like, how do we figure out what really matters to us? Like, how do we sort through all the noise and find our own values?
Well, Manson suggests we start by questioning the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we believe.
Oh, okay. So like those narratives we create in our minds.
Exactly, because those stories aren't always accurate.
It's kind of like how we might embellish a story every time we tell it, right?
Mm.
And eventually, we start to believe the embellished version.
Yeah, and it's the same with our beliefs and values. We might adopt them based on what we're told we should value or what we think we should value. But we don't always stop and ask ourselves, do these actually align with who I am at my core?
So it's about becoming more self-aware, right? Really
Sure.
taking a hard look at our beliefs and behaviors.
Exactly. Self-awareness is crucial for growth because it helps us to see our own patterns, both the good and the bad.
So we can identify the areas where we might be holding ourselves back.
Exactly. He uses the example of his own struggles with procrastination and how he realized it wasn't just laziness, it was rooted in a fear of failure and this need to be perfect.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Once you understand the why behind your behavior, you can start to address it in a more meaningful way.
It's not about beating ourselves up for our flaws, but approaching them with compassion and a willingness to learn.
Like being a good friend to ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't berate a friend for struggling with something, we'd offer them support and encouragement.
So that self-compassion is really key for growth because it allows us to experiment, make mistakes, and learn from them without getting bogged down by shame or self-doubt.
Yeah, it's like giving ourselves permission to be human.
And this ties back into choosing our struggles wisely, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're more self-aware, we can pick challenges that actually align with our values and help us to grow in a way that feels meaningful.
It's about being intentional with our energy and our choices. And Manson makes this distinction between problems of preference and problems of reality.
Oh, okay. What's the difference?
Well, problems of preference are those that stem from our own desires and expectations. Like, I wish I had a bigger house, or I wish I were more popular.
So things we have more control over than we realize because we can choose to change our desires and expectations.
Exactly. Whereas problems of reality are things like, losing a job, getting sick, things we can't necessarily control.
But we can control how we choose to respond to them.
Yeah, that's where those values really come in. They give us a framework for navigating those tough situations and making choices that are aligned with what's important to us.
So it's about focusing on what we can control, our attitudes, our efforts, our responses, and not getting caught up in the things that are outside of our control.
Right, because ultimately it's our reactions that determine our experience.
And this makes me think about the dangers of comparison, which is something that Manson talks a lot about. It's so easy to fall into that trap, especially in the age of social media,
Oh, it's everywhere you look. And it makes it hard to appreciate our own journey and celebrate our own accomplishments.
because we end up measuring ourselves against other people's carefully curated online personas instead of focusing on our own progress.
Exactly. And Manson argues that the antidote to comparison is authenticity, being true to ourselves, embracing our quirks and imperfections, and letting go of the need to fit in or impress others.
It's about owning our own story, even the messy parts.
Because when we try to be someone we're not, we end up feeling unfulfilled and disconnected from our true selves.
Like we're living someone else's life instead of our own.
And that leads to resentment, anxiety, and a whole lot of unnecessary suffering.
So it's not just about not giving a feck about what other people think. It's also about not giving a feck about the expectations and shoulds that we put on ourselves.
You got it. It's about challenging those internalized rules and expectations that might be holding us back from living an authentic and fulfilling life.
And that makes me think of this other concept from the book, this idea of letting go of the need to be right all the time.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Because our egos often get in the way of growth and connection.
Like we're so attached to being right that we miss out on opportunities to learn and connect with others who might have a different perspective.
It's like that old saying, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy?
So he's encouraging us to cultivate humility,
Exactly. Be open to different perspectives and admit when we're wrong.
which is so much easier said than done, right? Especially in today's world where it feels like everyone is digging in their heels and doubling down on their beliefs.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's a worthy one because when we let go of the need to be right all the time, we open ourselves up to new possibilities, new relationships, and a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
So it seems like the subtle art of not giving effect isn't about not caring at all. It's more about being selective with our energy and attention, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that our time and energy are finite and we should be spending them on the things that actually matter to us, the things that align with our values and contribute to our well being.
And letting go of the things that drain us and hold us back from living a more fulfilling life.
It's about embracing the messy, imperfect reality of being human, accepting ourselves with all our flaws, and striving to live a life that is authentic and aligned with our deepest values.
If you had to sum up the entire book in just one sentence, what would it be?
Choose your battles wisely, both internal and external, and fight like hell for the things that matter.
I love that. I think Mark Manson would be proud. Well, that was quite the deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck. It's given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for you. Thanks for listening.